The first where she noticed was the light. It came through the blinds at the same angle it always did on a clear morning, that particular blade of gold that crossed the foot of the bed and landed on the floor, exactly 17 centimeters from the baseboards. Marin had lived in this apartment for 6 years and she knew the light. She knew it the way you know a scar, not by looking, but by feel, by the way the body registers something that has been there long enough to stop surprising it. The light was fine. The light was exactly right. That was the problem. She lay still and listened. Outside, a bus on the Rue de la Parne, right on schedule. Someone's window opening 2 floors up. The pigeons on the cornice doing whatever pigeons did in the morning. All of it exactly where she'd left it. All of it so precisely where she'd left it that she felt, before she had a word for the feeling, that she was being watched. Damien was still asleep beside her. His breathing had that slow, rolling quality it got when he was deep under. When the world had been kind enough to leave him alone through the night. She studied his shoulder blade, the specific architecture of it, the way the skin moved when he breathed. He was real. She was reasonably sure he was real. She got up. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it the night before. The half-finished glass of water on the counter. The dish towel folded over the oven handle at a slight angle she'd been meaning to fix. The calendar on the wall with the red circle around the 15th. She stood in front of it for a long time. It was the 15th. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the window, watching the street wake up. A woman walked a dog past the boulangerie. A delivery truck idled for 3 minutes at the corner before the driver climbed down, checked something under the hood, climbed back up, drove on. The sky was that particular shade of washed-out blue that meant no clouds by afternoon. She was halfway through the coffee when she realized she had seen all of this before. Not in the general way that mornings resemble mornings. In the precise way, the woman and the dog at exactly that corner, the truck at exactly that moment, the specific quality of that specific blue. She set the cup down carefully. Damien was awake when she came back. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor with an expression she had never seen on him. Not quite fear, not quite recognition. Something in between that didn't have a good name. He looked up when she came in and she saw it then. The exact expression. She had seen it before. Not on him. On herself, in a mirror, this morning, the other morning, the morning before that morning. "You dreamed," she said. He nodded. "Tell me the dream." He looked at her for a moment. "There were no people in it," he said, "just parts of people. Hands without arms. A row of heads on a shelf, all facing the same direction. Feet walking with no one attached. And everything was." He stopped. Everything was being sorted, arranged. Like someone was trying to figure out how the pieces fit. She sat down on the bed. The light was exactly where it always was. "I had the same dream," she said. They didn't speak for a while. Outside, the bus came and went. The pigeons relocated. The morning proceeded with the serene indifference of a morning that has been rehearsed. "It's the 15th, Damien said. Yes, it was the 15th yesterday. Yes, she watched him process this. He was a careful thinker, Damien. An engineer by training, a man who preferred to have all the information before he formed a conclusion. She watched him not form a conclusion. She watched him approach the edge of it and stop. "I'm going to work," he said. She let him go. She spent the day paying attention. She walked the same route she always walked to the market, past the hardware store, and the pharmacy, and the small park where the old men played chess in the afternoon. Everything was exactly where it should be. The old men were playing chess. The pharmacy had the same sign in the window it had had yesterday. A promotion on antihistamines, the yellow letters on blue. She stopped in front of the hardware store and looked at the window display for a long time. Drill bits. A coil of orange extension cord. A box of 2-inch nails, the lid slightly open. A few nails spilled on the display cloth in a pattern she recognized with the bottom of her stomach. She took out her phone and photographed it. Then she photographed the sign at the pharmacy. The chess players from across the street. The particular way the trees in the park threw shadows on the gravel at 11:40 in the morning. She went home and she waited. Damien came home at the usual time. He looked tired in the way he always looked tired on a working day, that specific hollowness around the eyes that came from 8 hours of fluorescent light. He put his bag on the chair by the door, the same chair, the same hook. "Anything?" she asked. He sat down. "My colleague said something strange. I asked him what the date was. He said the 15th. I said, No, what's the date today? He looked at me like I'd asked him what color the sky was. He rubbed his face. I went into the archive room, pulled out the previous week's paperwork. The dates are all there, right up through the 14th. Nothing after. Like the world just stopped filing. She showed him the photographs on her phone. He scrolled through them slowly. The drill bits, the nails, the chess players, the shadows. He scrolled back to the beginning and through again. His face was very still. This is a record, he said. Yes. You're making a record because you thought no one else would. Someone has to. He handed her phone back. What are we dealing with? She had been thinking about this all day. She'd sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis you already knew was coming. Not processing it so much as giving it room, letting it take up the space it needed. I don't know the mechanics, she said, but something is holding the day in place, keeping it from becoming the 16th. And whatever it is, she paused. It doesn't know we can tell. It hasn't accounted for us noticing. Damien was quiet for a moment. That seems like a significant error. Yes, she said. It does. She found the other one 3 loops later. She'd started keeping a journal by then, writing the date at the top of each entry, and then crossing it out and writing, still the 15th in its place. She wrote down everything that changed and everything that didn't. Mostly it was the latter. The world had been frozen with extraordinary care, with an attention to detail that bordered on pathological. The nail pattern in the hardware window, the exact placement of the chess pieces, the particular slant of afternoon light at 4:15. Whoever had built this had studied very hard. What they hadn't studied was deviation. She found it on the 5th repetition. The man at the cafe table on the corner of the Rue Chancel. The one who always had an espresso and a newspaper at 2 in the afternoon. He was there, as he'd always been, but on this loop he was holding the newspaper differently. Not reading it. Holding it up like a shield and watching her over the top of it. She sat down across from him. He lowered the paper. He was somewhere in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had grown into something more interesting. He looked at her the way she looked at him, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing it was coming. You're counting, he said. 5, she said. You? 11. He folded the paper precisely along its original creases. I wasn't sure anyone else was holding. I thought maybe it was just me. A medical thing. It's not a medical thing. No. He looked at the street, at the same bus making its same turn, at the same woman with the same dog. I've been trying to find the edge of it. Walk far enough in any direction. I got as far as the peripheric before it. Reset. What does reset feel like? He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. Like wing from a dream you almost caught. Like something reached into the middle of you and shuffled the cards. He looked at her. My name is Edouard. I was a systems analyst. Before I retired. I think that's why I feel the architecture of it. What's the architecture? A loop, he said. A very sophisticated one. But it has seams. He turned over the paper and she saw he'd been writing on the margins. Not words, diagrams, networks of nodes and edges. Here and here, the rendition isn't perfect. There are places where the reconstruction is approximate. Where it reaches, for a detail, it hasn't fully memorized and substitutes something close but wrong. She thought of the nail pattern, the slight wrongness of it that she hadn't been able to name. They studied us, she said. But they didn't understand what they were studying. No, Edward said. They didn't. And that. He tapped the diagram with one finger. That is the only thing I can find to work with, she told Damien that night. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. Edouard, the seams, the 11 loops, the margin diagrams. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. But then you're not a human being, he said. It wasn't a question. It was something else, something she didn't have a category for yet. Something between wonder and grief. She understood what he meant. If this was real, if some vast, inhuman intelligence had taken this day and this city and these people and pressed them into amber, had studied and mapped and reproduced the contents of their lives with a care so meticulous it verged on devotion, then what did that make all of them? Specimens, components, the parts of a thing that had been disassembled to see how it worked. Neither are you, she said. Not to them. To them, Damien, we're pieces. We're the hands and the feet and the heads on the shelf. And they've been trying to figure out how we fit together. She reached across the table and took his hands. But they made one mistake. They forgot that pieces know they're part of something larger, and something that knows it's been taken apart can put itself back together. He looked at their hands. She watched him make the decision. "What do we do?" he said. Edouard called it the seam at the market. There was a place he'd found, between the flower stall and the fish counter, where the reconstruction faltered. The flowers were right, each stem, each color, the specific way the roses leaned against their bucket. But the smell was wrong, not absent exactly, approximate. A studied version of what flowers smelled like, assembled from data rather than experience. You had to know the market very well to catch it. You had to have spent years here. Had to have the real smell so deep in your memory that the copy caught in your throat like a splinter. They stood in front of the flower stall on the 7th loop. Damien reached out and touched a rose petal. "It's right," he said. "It looks completely right." "Smell it," Marin said. He leaned in, pulled back, said nothing for a moment. "Like a photograph of a rose." "Yes." Edouard was sketching something on a card, a small card, the size of a business card, that he'd been carrying for several loops, adding to it each time. She'd seen him do it. On the reset, the card came back with him, his changes intact, because the card was his and not part of the simulation. Anything they carried in their bodies, their memories, their knowing, survived. The world reset around them and they held. "That's the principle," she said. "Whatever is doing this can copy everything it can observe. It can't copy what's inside us, what we remember, what we feel." "Then the question," Edouard said, not looking up from the card, "is what they can't observe that we can do." She'd been thinking about this since the 2nd loop. She'd thought about it the way she used to think about impossible design problems at her old job. Back when she'd worked with architects, and the whole challenge was to make a building feel like something rather than just be something. The difference between a structure that was technically perfect and a structure that made you feel, walking into it, like you'd come home. The difference was not in the walls. It was in the accumulation of imprecision, the slight irregularity in the floor tiles, the way the light came in at an angle that wasn't optimal but was somehow right, the dents and variations and errors that added up to something that could only have been made by people, for people, over time. She thought, "What is the most human thing I can do right now, in this specific place, that no studied copy of humanity could anticipate or replicate?" The answer came to her while she was looking at the flowers. She began to hum. It was nothing. A tune her mother had sung when she was 7 years old, something small and private, a folk song from her mother's province that she'd never heard anywhere else, that existed in no database, that had passed from one human mouth to one small human ear on a specific afternoon in a specific kitchen in a village outside Lyon, and that now existed only in Marin, in the specific reverberant cavity of her memory, nowhere else on Earth or off it. She hummed it very quietly. Edouard stopped writing. The flowers moved, not dramatically, not like something out of a film, just a slight, wrong tremor. The roses nodding in a way roses didn't nod. The tulips shivering at a frequency that had nothing to do with wind. The smell corrected itself for a fraction of a second, became briefly and overwhelmingly real, and then snapped back to its facsimile. The simulation had tried to respond to something it didn't understand, and in doing so, it had shown them exactly where it was fragile. "There," Edouard said. They worked through 2 more loops. Edouard mapped the seams, all the places where the reconstruction was approximate, where the alien attention had slipped or settled for close enough. There were more of them than she'd expected. The birdsong was wrong above the park. Not wrong to a casual ear, but deeply wrong to anyone who'd sat on that bench for years and knew how the starlings talked to each other in the afternoon. The texture of the bread at the boulangerie was slightly off, the crust too uniform, missing the random geography of real fermentation. The smell of rain on pavement, which it had rained once during a loop and she'd noticed, was theoretically accurate and viscerally false. They were living inside a portrait painted by someone who had studied thousands of photographs of a face, but never seen it in person, never seen it laugh or cry or change in the light. What they assembled over those 2 loops was less a plan than a practice, a sustained act of being very precisely human, of flooding the simulated 15th of May with all the irregularity and irreproducibility that the simulation could not contain. Damien started telling jokes, not good ones, his worst ones, the ones she'd asked him to stop telling years ago, the ones whose punchlines made no logical sense, and whose humor, if it existed at all, lived entirely in the way he told them, in the specific rhythm of his voice, and the way he pre-logged at his own setups. She laughed at them. She actually laughed. She hadn't expected to. Eduard wrote a letter to someone he'd loved 30 years ago and never spoken to again. He wrote it by hand on the back of his margin diagram cards. He read parts of it aloud. The parts he read aloud, he cried over. Not dramatically, just a wetness at the corners of his eyes that he didn't acknowledge and didn't hide. She didn't know if the letter mattered to the mechanism of what they were doing. She thought maybe it did. She thought maybe it mattered in the way that made the least sense and the most. She kept humming. She hummed the tune in the market, in the park, walking down the Rue de l'Epargne, sitting in the kitchen, while the coffee made its sounds. She emmed at the seams Eduard had marked, at the places where the simulation was thinnest. She felt as she did, something she could not verify, a kind of pressure, like the moment before a door gives, like the moment before a word you've forgotten comes back to you. On the 9th loop, she woke up and the light was wrong, not dangerously wrong, not wrong in a way that would have alarmed her before all of this. Just different. The blade of gold through the blinds was a degree or two off. 17 centimeters had become 18, maybe 19. It crossed the floor at a different angle. Damien was already awake beside her watching the ceiling. Something changed, he said. Yes. Is it better or worse? She thought about it honestly. The light being wrong meant the simulation had slipped. It meant something they'd done had reached whatever sustained all of this, and disrupted it, even fractionally, had introduced a variable the system couldn't account for. It meant they had been noticed. She thought about being noticed by something vast and inhuman and calculating, something that had had no trouble holding this entire day in amber for however long, something that was presumably paying more careful attention to them now. Better, she said. It means we're real to them. The end came on a Tuesday, or what would have been a Tuesday if Tuesdays had been allowed to exist. The 15th was technically a Thursday, but she'd stopped caring about that distinction several loops ago. It came at the flower stall. She was humming. She was almost always humming now. It had become less a strategy than a habit. The tune so present in her that she hummed it the way people hummed when they were washing dishes, without deciding to. And Eduard was standing beside her with his card. And Damien was a few feet away buying bread from the approximate crust boulangerie. And the flowers were doing their small, wrong trembling, and she realized she was not afraid. She had been afraid, in the early loops. The fear had been enormous and formless, the kind of fear that has no object because its object is everything. The fear of the day that won't turn into the next day. The fear of the dream about the bodies on the shelf. But something had happened to it over all these 15ths of May. She had hummed and laughed, and let Eduard read her his letter, and told Damien his jokes were terrible, and held the inconsistencies in her palm like coins. And somewhere along the way, the fear had metabolized into something else. Something quieter and much more durable. Stubbornness, maybe. That specific human brand of it. The kind that isn't brave, exactly, but simply cannot be persuaded that stopping is an option. She hymned him the last bar of the tune, and then, instead of starting it again, she stopped. The flowers stopped trembling. The simulation held its breath. She waited in the silence, and she felt it. The weight of whatever was watching. The enormous patient attention of something that had spent all this time studying hands and faces and habits and sounds, that had built this meticulous copy of a world and couldn't understand why the copies kept knowing they were copies. She felt it the way you feel a very large thing in a dark room, not by seeing it, by the air. She spoke to it, not aloud. She was not the kind of person who spoke to rooms. She spoke to it the way you speak to a presence you cannot name, from the chest, from whatever center gravity lives in. You got the light right. She thought. You got the nails right and the bus schedule and the chess and the approximate bread. You studied very hard and you were very precise. But you can't study into us the thing you needed most. You can only study what you can observe. And the most human thing there is, the tune, the joke, the letter to the person you never called, is the thing nobody's watching when it happens. The silence went on for a long time. Then it was the 16th, just like that. No drama, no light show, no collapse. The morning light through the blinds was in a completely new position. Thin and gray and genuine. A February angle, honest about being February. Outside, a different bus on a new schedule. Somewhere, pigeons settling into the altered morning. The calendar on the kitchen wall had not changed. She walked into the kitchen and looked at it. The red circle was around the 15th, still there, still hers. She made coffee. She was standing at the window when Damien appeared in the doorway. He looked at her, and she saw in his face everything she felt. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but that particular quality of a person who has been held down for a long time and has stood up again and is not entirely sure yet what to do with vertical. He stood there for a moment. Then he told her the worst joke he knew. She laughed. She actually laughed. She drank her coffee and watched the street, and the street was different. Not better. Not safer. Just new, which was all she'd ever wanted it to be. New and unremembered, and full of the kind of mourning that has not been rehearsed. Later, she would not be able to explain it in a way that satisfied anyone who hadn't been there. Not the investigators who came. Not the researchers who wrote papers. Not the people who made the documentaries. She would try each time to explain the thing that had broken it, the tune, the irreproducibility of it, the small private human inheritance that no database could hold. And she would see in the faces of her listeners the look of people who were waiting for something more, something bigger, something that would make sense as a story. But she had been inside it, and she knew. The most human thing there is does not make sense as a story. It makes sense as a feeling, in the moment you have it, and then it's gone from the record. And the only proof it ever existed is the particular shape of the room it changed. She put her cup down. She went to find Edouard. There were things to tell him about the 16th,